In the winter of 1972, an uninvited visitor slipped quietly through the side doors of a sprawling brick institution on Staten Island, New York. He was not a doctor, nor a parent, nor a staff member. He was a journalist, a young man with a handheld camera hidden beneath his coat, and what he recorded inside those walls would forever change the way America thought about science, medicine, and the care of its most vulnerable children. His name was Geraldo Rivera, and his exposé would later be called Willowbrook, the Last Disgrace. But before that night, Willowbrook State School had existed mostly in silence, its residents locked away, its practices shielded from public scrutiny, its secrets known only to doctors, nurses, and the children who could not speak for themselves. Imagine a room with 200 children packed together, the air thick with the sour stench of urine and disinfectant, the sound of coughing and wailing bouncing off concrete walls. Thin mattresses line the floor, some stained and torn. In the corner, a child rocks back and forth, humming to no one. Another sits naked, eyes vacant, body covered in sores. The camera lingers on faces that do not smile, on lips that never speak. These are not the images of care and compassion that the state of New York had promised. These are the images of abandonment. And then, deeper still, there is something even darker. Hidden beneath the official language of research, beneath the promises of medical advancement, lies a truth that even today chills the bones. Some of these children were not just neglected. They were experimented upon, fed food deliberately laced with the virus of hepatitis, their blood drawn over and over, their suffering cataloged in neat columns of numbers. To the outside world, Willowbrook was a school. In reality, it was a laboratory, and its subjects were children who never volunteered, children who could never say no. What you are about to hear is not a horror story imagined in fiction. It is a piece of American history, real and documented, stretching across 2 decades. It is the story of how science, unchecked by ethics, can cross a line so deep that generations later we still recoil at the sound of its name. Willowbrook. Before we begin, I want to invite you, wherever you are listening from tonight, to pause for a moment and reflect on this. History is full of hidden corners, places where the vulnerable were silenced, and only by uncovering them do we learn to never repeat them. If you find value in exploring these forgotten truths, I encourage you to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done had you been a parent in that time, presented with the choice between neglect and research? And as you listen, let me know, does the story feel different when you imagine it happening in your own town? This is not a comfortable journey, but it is a necessary one. Because the children of Willowbrook cannot speak for themselves, we must speak for them. Our story begins not in 1972, with the camera of a journalist, but in the years after World War II, when America was flush with optimism, population booming, suburbs spreading, and promises of new institutions rising like monuments to progress. It was a time when the word school carried a sense of hope, of education, of structured care. Yet for thousands of children with intellectual and developmental disabilities, the word meant something else entirely. It meant confinement. It meant abandonment. And at Willowbrook, it meant being turned into objects of study. The origins of Willowbrook tell us much about the gap between promise and reality. In the early 1940s, as New York prepared to build what was supposed to be the largest state-run institution for children with disabilities, the vision was grand. Architects drew up sprawling plans, with wide halls and modern dormitories, capacity for thousands of residents, and medical wings equipped with the latest technology. It was to be the pride of Staten Island, a shining example of public investment in care. By the time it officially opened in 1947, politicians praised it as a landmark of progress. Parents, desperate and exhausted, were told that here their children would be cared for with dignity, fed, clothed, educated. But the photographs taken on those opening days are cruelly deceptive. For behind the smiling officials and the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the seeds of tragedy were already planted. The facility was designed for 4,000 residents. Within a decade, it held nearly 6,000. By the early 1960s, the number would rise above 6,200. Rooms built for 20 children held 50. One nurse was often responsible for more than 100 residents. Beds were scarce, clothing inadequate, food rationed. The so-called school became a warehouse of suffering. This was the stage upon which the experiments would begin. And this was the world the children of Willowbrook inherited, not because of anything they had done, but because society had no place else for them. The Second World War had ended in triumph for the United States. Soldiers returned home to ticker-tape parades and the promise of a new prosperity. Suburbs expanded outward from the cities, filling with the sound of hammers and the laughter of children. It was the beginning of what would later be called the baby boom, a surge of births that filled classrooms, playgrounds, and family albums. But not every child fit the image of America's bright new future. For families whose sons or daughters were born with developmental disabilities, the promise of suburban bliss carried a shadow. In the post-war years, the prevailing wisdom was simple. Such children did not belong at home. Doctors told parents bluntly that their disabled child would never learn, never grow independent, never live what society called a normal life. The recommendation was institutionalization. For many families, already overwhelmed and stigmatized, there seemed little choice. Institutions were presented as both relief and solution. Parents were assured their children would receive education, medical care, and the companionship of others like them. And so, with heavy hearts, they signed the papers and delivered their children into the care of the state. Willowbrook was built to embody that promise. Rising on the northern edge of Staten Island, it sprawled across hundreds of acres. Red brick buildings surrounded by lawns that, from the outside, looked almost collegiate. Politicians spoke of it as a modern marvel, the largest facility of its kind in the world. It was designed to house 4,000 children. In speeches, the number was presented as proof of efficiency, a bold answer to a growing need. Few considered what such scale might mean for the quality of life inside. The truth, revealed slowly over the years, was that even from the beginning, the institution was overwhelmed. The baby boom flooded its wards. By the mid-1950s, enrollment far exceeded the official capacity. Families kept arriving, desperate for placement, and the state kept accepting. By the early 1960s, more than 6,200 residents filled the buildings. Hallways that had once been wide and open became crowded with beds. Dormitories designed for 20 children squeezed in 50. The ratio of staff to residents fell to appalling lows. Sometimes one nurse for 100 children, sometimes fewer. The conditions this produced were inevitable. Food was stretched thin, clothing was shared, toilets overflowed. Diseases spread like wildfire, particularly hepatitis, which seemed to haunt every corner of the school. Children wandered unattended, some clothed, others naked, their care left to exhausted staff who could not possibly meet the need. Reports from those who worked there spoke of filth, of lice, of sores left untreated. Willowbrook was supposed to be a school. Instead, it became a warehouse. And yet, to the outside world, the institution maintained its facade. Politicians cut ribbons at new wings. Photographs showed smiling children at carefully staged events, and the public largely accepted that these were places of safety. Few parents visited regularly. Travel was difficult, shame was heavy, and for many the separation was permanent. Once a child entered Willowbrook, it was as if they disappeared into another world, one closed off by locked doors and long corridors. It is here, in this climate of overcrowding and neglect, that the story of experimentation took root. The very conditions that made Willowbrook unbearable also made it attractive to researchers. The rampant spread of hepatitis, considered inevitable in such institutions, provided a ready-made laboratory. Children were already falling ill, already serving as unintentional subjects in a grim natural experiment. Why not? Some doctors reasoned, take control of the process. Why not infect in a controlled way, observe carefully, and learn? It was logic born of desperation, and it would set Willowbrook on a path toward infamy. But in the 1950s, few questioned the morality of such reasoning. Eugenic ideas still lingered in American thought, the belief that the disabled were somehow lesser, their suffering less consequential. In a culture that measured human worth by productivity, children with severe intellectual disabilities were often seen as burdens. To study them was not viewed as exploitation, but as utility. The public rarely asked what life was like behind the brick walls. They preferred not to know. At home in Staten Island, the institution loomed as a presence both physical and psychological. Residents of the island knew it as the largest employer, a place that swallowed thousands of children out of sight. The name Willowbrook became synonymous with the disabled, whispered in the same breath as shame. For parents, it was both a sentence and a relief. They could tell themselves their child was being cared for, even if deep down they suspected otherwise. The reality was darker. Testimonies from former staff later revealed that training was minimal, turnover constant, and conditions degrading not only for the residents, but for the employees themselves. Overcrowding bred despair. Many staff members burned out quickly, leaving behind only the most hardened or indifferent. The institution became less a school than a holding pen, less a medical facility than a cage. This was the environment in which hepatitis thrived, spreading from child to child through unsanitary bathrooms, shared utensils, and the simple impossibility of hygiene in such crowded quarters. For the doctors who observed this, the outbreak became an opportunity. Here was a population already exposed, already at risk, already suffering. Why not, they reasoned, use it to gain knowledge that might help others? To understand the reasoning that followed, one must grasp the social climate of the time. The concept of informed consent was still fragile. The Nuremberg trials had condemned the atrocities of Nazi medical experiments only a few years earlier, but their lessons had not yet fully reshaped American medicine. Ethics committees were rare, oversight was minimal. Vulnerable populations, prisoners, the mentally ill, the disabled, were often seen as acceptable subjects. Willowbrook was no exception. Thus, in the quiet corridors of an institution already bursting with need, the stage was set. A prominent pediatrician would soon walk through those halls and see not tragedy, but opportunity. His name was Saul Krugman, and he would become both a pioneer of hepatitis research and a figure forever associated with one of the most controversial studies in American medical history. By the mid-1950s, Willowbrook State School was no longer simply an overcrowded institution. It was a breeding ground for disease. The most relentless of these afflictions was hepatitis, a viral infection that attacked the liver, spreading silently from one child to another, leaving behind waves of yellowed eyes, swollen bellies, and fevered cries. In most communities, an outbreak would have sparked panic. At Willowbrook, it was routine. Everywhere one looked, the signs were there. Children grew listless, their skin turning the dull shade of wax. Some vomited repeatedly. Others grew so weak they could not stand. Jaundice was common, and the smell of sickness lingered in the wards like smoke after a fire. Nurses, already stretched beyond capacity, learned to identify new cases almost instantly. The disease was so widespread that it became part of the daily vocabulary of the school. In some wards, nearly all the children carried the virus. Doctors who visited the institution shook their heads, not with outrage, but with resignation. They called it inevitable. With so many children packed together, with hygiene impossible to maintain, hepatitis was seen as an unavoidable fact of life. Administrators treated it as background noise, another unpleasant but expected element of institutional life. But where others saw inevitability, some physicians saw something else: opportunity. At that time, hepatitis was poorly understood. Scientists knew of its symptoms but had little grasp of its causes, its types, or how it spread. Two broad categories were recognized: hepatitis A, often transmitted through contaminated food and water, and hepatitis B, carried in blood and bodily fluids. Yet even these distinctions were hazy in the 1950s. Vaccines did not exist, treatments were minimal, and outbreaks in hospitals and schools were common. To medical researchers, hepatitis represented both a puzzle and a threat. If only it could be studied more closely, perhaps a cure or prevention could be found. And so, the logic unfolded with chilling simplicity. If hepatitis was already rampant at Willowbrook, then the children there represented a ready-made laboratory. They were exposed anyway, the reasoning went. Why not take advantage of the situation? Why not infect them deliberately, under controlled conditions, to study the disease's progression? In the distorted morality of the time, this seemed not only reasonable, but efficient. Enter Dr. Saul Krugman, a pediatrician affiliated with New York University and the Veterans Administration Hospital. Krugman was ambitious, respected, and determined to solve the riddle of hepatitis. When he toured Willowbrook and saw the sheer scale of infection, he recognized a unique opportunity. Here was a population of children, vulnerable, segregated from society, and living in an environment where the disease was rampant. The conditions were appalling for care, but perfect for study. Krugman proposed a series of experiments that would become infamous. New admissions to Willowbrook, children freshly arrived at the institution, would be given food laced with the virus. Sometimes it was mixed into chocolate milkshakes, sometimes into oatmeal. The children would drink, unsuspecting, and within weeks they would develop the illness. Their blood would be drawn, their symptoms carefully documented, their stools analyzed. Krugman believed this would provide crucial insights into the different forms of hepatitis and how immunity developed. To gain access, Krugman needed consent, or something that resembled it. Parents were told their children were likely to contract hepatitis anyway, simply by living at Willowbrook. Participation in the study, they were assured, would mean their child was placed in a newer, cleaner ward with better staff attention. Many parents, overwhelmed and desperate, agreed. Some may not have fully understood what they were signing. Others may have felt they had no choice. After all, the alternative was to leave their child in the overcrowded, disease-ridden general wards. In this way, consent became less an act of free will than a transaction born of fear and coercion. The experiments began quietly. At first, only a handful of children were involved. Their progress was charted meticulously. Temperature spikes, jaundice, appetite changes, all recorded in neat handwriting in medical files. Blood samples were analyzed for antibodies, stool samples examined under microscopes. For the children, the experience was bewildering, painful, and frightening. For the doctors, it was data. As the studies expanded, Krugman and his colleagues published their findings in medical journals. They argued that their work had helped distinguish between hepatitis A and B and had advanced the understanding of how immunity developed. Some in the medical community praised the research as groundbreaking. Few, at least publicly, questioned the morality of deliberately infecting disabled children with a dangerous virus. Within Willowbrook, the studies blended seamlessly into the grim routine of institutional life. Children continued to fall ill whether part of the experiments or not. Staff carried on with their impossible workloads. Administrators quietly supported the research, seeing in it both prestige and a justification for the school's existence. The residents themselves, hundreds of children who could not comprehend what was happening, remained voiceless, their suffering converted into tables and charts. Looking back, the ethical violations are staggering. The children of Willowbrook were not volunteers. They could not consent, could not understand. Their parents, often pressured and misled, were hardly in a position to make an informed choice. The very environment that made hepatitis inevitable was a product of neglect and overcrowding. And yet, instead of addressing those conditions, science turned them into justification for exploitation. But at the time, few beyond the walls of Willowbrook knew what was happening. The studies continued for years, shaping the medical understanding of hepatitis, even as the children themselves remained locked in wards of filth and despair. The infection, the suffering, the endless data collection, all of it became part of a hidden archive, unseen by the world outside. This was the turning point. Willowbrook was no longer merely a failed institution. It was a stage where science and suffering collided, where the vulnerable became subjects, and where the line between care and cruelty blurred beyond recognition. The phrase informed consent carries with it the idea of choice, of individuals freely deciding, with full knowledge, whether or not to participate in medical research. At Willowbrook, however, consent was a shadow, an echo of the real thing. Parents were presented with forms, explanations, and reassurances, but the reality was far from genuine autonomy. In practice, It was closer to coercion cloaked in medical language. Most families who brought their children to Willowbrook did so in desperation. They had often struggled for years with limited support at home. Many were working class, some living in poverty. Raising a child with severe developmental disabilities without state assistance was nearly impossible. Waiting lists for institutional placement were long, and parents were often told bluntly that Willowbrook was their only option. By the time they walked through the institution's doors, their choices had already narrowed to almost nothing. It was under these circumstances that researchers approached them. The offer seemed straightforward, even generous. If you agree to let your child participate in our study, they will be placed in a newer, cleaner wing, with better staff-to-resident ratios, improved supervision, and more attention. In a place where the general wards were overcrowded, filthy, and rife with disease, this sounded like salvation. The alternative was to leave their child in the chaos of the main dormitories, where infection and neglect were nearly guaranteed. So when the forms were slid across the table, many parents signed. But what, exactly, were they agreeing to? The documents explained that their children would likely contract hepatitis anyway, so the research merely formalized the inevitable. The difference, parents were told, was that under the study, their children would be carefully monitored, and doctors might learn something that could one day lead to a vaccine. The framing was deliberate. This is not harm, it is prevention. This is not exploitation, it is science in service of future children. What was left unsaid was critical. Parents were rarely told the full scope of the risks. They were not informed that their children would be deliberately infected, that their suffering would be intentionally induced rather than passively observed. They were not told that the so-called improved conditions were contingent upon their agreement, and they were not given real alternatives. Decline the study, and your child remained in the most dangerous wards. Except, and at least they would have a cleaner bed, perhaps a nurse with more time to spare. It was less a choice than a subtle form of extortion. For researchers like Dr. Saul Krugman, this was not seen as unethical. In interviews years later, he defended the experiments by insisting that the children would have contracted hepatitis anyway. In his view, the studies did not add suffering, they simply directed it toward science. They were going to get it no matter what, he argued. By his logic, the research was not exploitation, but a rational use of unfortunate circumstances. Many of his colleagues agreed. The findings they produced were hailed in some circles as a breakthrough in understanding hepatitis. The children's pain was invisible in the glow of scientific progress. But in reality, the very conditions that made infection inevitable were a failure of the state itself. Overcrowding, neglect, and unsanitary facilities had created a hotbed of disease. Instead of fixing those problems, doctors used them as justification. They turned systemic neglect into a research opportunity, and the children paid the price. Accounts from parents reveal the unease many felt. Some described signing the forms reluctantly, aware they were agreeing to something they did not fully understand, but feeling powerless to refuse. Others recalled being pressured by administrators who warned that without cooperation, their children might not receive care at all. There were no advocates present, no independent boards to review the ethics, no lawyers to explain the implications. Consent was reduced to a signature extracted under duress. The illusion of choice extended beyond the paperwork. Once inside the study, children were subjected to procedures they could not comprehend. Blood draws, stool collections, endless examinations. For some, the repeated invasions became routine, woven into the monotony of institutional life. For others, it was terror without explanation. Their cries echoed in sterile hallways, while doctors took notes, and parents remained miles away, unaware of the daily realities. This is where the story of Willowbrook begins to expose not only the cruelty of the experiments, but the fragility of the safeguards meant to protect the vulnerable. At the time, there was no federal requirement for institutional review boards, no independent oversight to ensure that consent was valid. The memory of the Nuremberg trials, with their condemnation of Nazi medical atrocities, had not yet reshaped American medical ethics. What had been judged as barbaric overseas was, in a softer, quieter form, tolerated at home. The illusion of consent was not unique to Willowbrook. Across the country in the mid-20th century, prisoners, orphans, the mentally ill and the poor were frequently used in research without full knowledge or genuine choice. But Willowbrook stood out because of the sheer vulnerability of its subjects, children with intellectual disabilities, incapable of even understanding the word consent, let alone offering it. To the medical establishment of the time, the calculus seemed clear. The potential benefit, new understanding of hepatitis, possible vaccines, outweighed the costs. The children, in their view, had little to lose. But to any observer with even a trace of humanity, the imbalance is glaring. The cost was not abstract. It was born in the bodies of children, in their fevers, their weakness, their confusion. It was written in the quiet sobs of boys and girls who never asked to be part of an experiment, and whose parents were given no real alternative. The illusion of consent made the experiments appear legitimate. But legitimacy is not morality. The paperwork might have satisfied the institutions and the journals that published the results, but it did not erase the fundamental truth. These children were used, not helped. Their suffering was mined for knowledge, and their rights were trampled beneath the weight of scientific ambition. Once the forms were signed, the children chosen for the studies were moved into special wards. These wings, compared to the rest of Willowbrook, seemed almost luxurious. The floors were cleaner, the air smelled less foul, the ratio of staff to children was somewhat improved. To outsiders, this might have appeared like a blessing, a sign that the institution could provide proper care when it wanted to. But beneath the surface, these wards had a singular purpose: to serve as laboratories. Each new child admitted to the study began with a ritual. Blood was drawn almost immediately, the first of countless times. The children cried, squirmed, or stared blankly as nurses held down their arms. Vials were labeled carefully, stored for analysis, their contents reduced to data points in the larger effort to track infection. The baseline established, the next step was more insidious: deliberate exposure. Food, oatmeal, pudding, chocolate milkshakes, was quietly mixed with material containing the hepatitis virus. The children ate, unaware, trusting the adults who placed the bowls before them. Within weeks, symptoms emerged. Fevers climbed, eyes turned yellow, stomachs swelled. Some vomited repeatedly, their frail bodies unable to withstand the assault. Others grew lethargic, retreating into silence, while a few thrashed with agitation, unable to express what was happening inside. Every reaction was recorded with clinical detachment. Doctors and researchers cycled through the wards, clipboards in hand. They observed the progression of the illness with fascination, noting how long it took for jaundice to appear, how high the fevers rose, how long the symptoms lingered. Children were weighed and measured, their urine and stool collected in labeled containers. The intimate functions of their bodies became scientific specimens, analyzed for viral particles, antibodies, and enzymes. For the children, the experience was a blur of discomfort and fear. Needles punctured their skin again and again. Their stools were taken from bedpans, their blood extracted so frequently that bruises bloomed along their arms. Some resisted, crying and struggling until staff restrained them. Others, worn down by repetition, submitted quietly, as if they had learned that resistance was futile. In their world, pain became routine. What is most haunting is the calm normality with which all this was carried out. For the staff and doctors, it was just another day at work. Charts had to be filled, samples collected, procedures followed. The atmosphere was not one of overt cruelty, but of clinical detachment, the kind that allows people to treat human suffering as mere information. The children were not called by their names, but by numbers. Their identities dissolved into case files, their voices muted beneath the hum of science. The studies stretched over years. Children cycled in and out of the wards, their illnesses documented with precision. The data accumulated: tables of incubation periods, graphs of antibody responses, charts mapping the difference between hepatitis A and B. In the world of medical journals, these findings were celebrated as important contributions, but in the wards themselves, The children continued to sicken, recover, relapse, and sometimes decline permanently. One former staff member, interviewed decades later, remembered the haunting quiet that followed each blood draw. "They would look at you," she said, "not understanding why. Just waiting for you to stop." Another described how some children tried to hide when the doctors entered, slipping under beds or crouching in corners, as though instinctively sensing danger. But there was no escape. The routines were relentless, and the institution offered no sanctuary. The justification for all of this remained the same. The children would have caught hepatitis anyway. But the difference between chance and intent is enormous. In the general wards, infection spread because of neglect. In the research wards, infection was manufactured, administered like medicine, but designed to harm. The distinction may have been invisible to the children, but it was profound in terms of morality. And yet, within the closed world of Willowbrook, no one seemed to question it. Administrators praised the research for bringing prestige. Doctors cited the studies as proof of their institution's value to science. Parents, when they visited, saw cleaner rooms, better-fed children, and were told the research was necessary and beneficial. Few realized that their sons and daughters were being used as test subjects in ways that violated every principle of medical ethics. The cycle of infection and observation became so entrenched that it blurred into the identity of Willowbrook itself. It was no longer just a school for disabled children. It was also a hepatitis research center, quietly fueling academic careers and medical conferences. The children, meanwhile, continued to live their lives in a fog of illness, their bodies repositories of data, their humanity buried beneath scientific ambition. Looking back now, the coldness of the process is chilling. The charts and graphs that emerged from these studies still exist in archives, tables of numbers that mask the reality of fevered nights, of frightened children, of cries that echoed through sterile corridors. Behind every data point was a child who did not understand why their body had become a battlefield. The daily reality of experimentation at Willowbrook reveals a truth as stark as any photograph. Science, stripped of ethics, can become indistinguishable from cruelty. What was carried out in those wards was not treatment, not care, but exploitation, systematic, organized, and disguised as progress. And it continued for years, shielded from scrutiny by the walls of the institution and the complacency of a society that preferred not to look too closely. From the outside, it may seem impossible to imagine how such experiments could ever have been allowed. Yet within the medical world of the 1950s and 1960s, the logic appeared sound, even commendable. To understand Willowbrook is to understand not only the cruelty of the acts, but the reasoning that sustained them. The doctors who carried out these studies did not see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as pioneers. Dr. Saul Krugman, the pediatrician at the center of the hepatitis research, defended his work throughout his career. In lectures and interviews, he explained that hepatitis was already rampant at Willowbrook. To him, the children's exposure was inevitable. They were going to get it anyway, he insisted. His argument was simple. By controlling the infection and studying it carefully, he could transform tragedy into knowledge. He believed his research would save lives beyond Willowbrook, sparing future generations from the scourge of hepatitis. This justification resonated with many in the medical community. At the time, hepatitis was one of the most pressing health challenges. Outbreaks struck schools, hospitals, and military bases, often with devastating consequences. Blood banks struggled with contaminated supplies. Vaccines were still a distant dream. To scientists hungry for solutions, Krugman's work appeared invaluable. His publications in leading journals were cited widely, and his findings were incorporated into the growing body of knowledge that would eventually lead to the development of vaccines. In this way, the suffering of Willowbrook's children was transmuted into professional prestige and scientific advancement. But the reasoning contained blind spots as vast as the wards themselves. The doctors rarely questioned the morality of infecting children deliberately. They treated the neglect that bred hepatitis not as a failure to be corrected, but as a resource to be exploited. The overcrowded, unsanitary conditions were not addressed. They were normalized. The disease-ridden environment became the justification for compounding harm, rather than eliminating it. The language of science further obscured the reality. In journal articles, the children were described as subjects, their experiences reduced to clinical terms: incubation period, antibody response, morbidity rates. Their cries and confusion disappeared into sterile charts. By abstracting the suffering into data, doctors could distance themselves from the human cost. To their peers, the research looked like progress. To the children, it was pain disguised as care. The broader culture reinforced this mindset. In mid-20th century America, disabled children were often seen as burdens on their families and on society. Institutions like Willowbrook existed precisely because the public believed these children did not belong at home or in the community. Their lives were devalued from the start. In such a context, the line between care and exploitation blurred easily. When the subjects are seen as lesser, their rights are easier to dismiss. There was also the weight of history. The world had only recently emerged from the revelations of the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi doctors were condemned for horrific human experiments. Yet even as the Nuremberg Code called for voluntary consent in research, American medicine often treated the principle as aspirational rather than binding. Vulnerable populations, prisoners, orphans, the mentally ill, were still used in studies without meaningful consent. Willowbrook was not an aberration but part of a larger pattern, a reflection of the ethical blind spots of its time. Krugman himself later acknowledged the controversy but never admitted wrongdoing. To the end of his life, he maintained that his work had been ethical, that the children had not been harmed beyond what they would have suffered anyway, and that his studies had directly contributed to the eventual development of the Hepatitis A vaccine. Many of his colleagues echoed this defense. The question of morality was subsumed under the banner of utility. If the research produced useful knowledge, then surely it was justified. But morality cannot be reduced to utility alone. The children of Willowbrook were not volunteers. Their parents were pressured, misled, or left with no real alternatives. The conditions that made hepatitis inevitable were themselves the result of systemic neglect. To exploit those conditions rather than remedy them was to betray the very idea of medicine as a healing profession. The justifications that seemed reasonable in the 1950s now stand exposed as rationalizations, attempts to mask exploitation behind the veneer of science. What is most haunting is how ordinary it all seemed at the time. In staff meetings and medical conferences, Willowbrook was discussed not as a scandal but as a case study. Charts were projected, data debated, results praised. The audience applauded, papers were published, careers advanced. Few paused to consider that the subjects were children with no voice, children who bore the burden of experiments they could neither understand nor refuse. This normalization is perhaps the greatest lesson of Willowbrook. Atrocities do not always announce themselves with violence or malice. Sometimes they emerge quietly, disguised as progress, sustained by reasoning that appears logical in the moment. They persist because institutions look the other way, because society prefers not to ask questions, and because the victims are those least able to defend themselves. The justifications of science at Willowbrook remind us of a dangerous truth. Knowledge can be pursued without wisdom, and progress can come at a cost too great to bear. The doctors who infected those children believed they were serving humanity. In reality, they were serving a vision of science, stripped of compassion, where the ends justified the means, and the voices of the vulnerable were silenced beneath the applause of professional success. For more than a decade, the hepatitis studies at Willowbrook unfolded with little resistance and in many corners of the medical establishment, with outright praise. The reports appeared in respected journals, presented at conferences, and cited as evidence of groundbreaking work in pediatric medicine. To the professional eye, they were elegant experiments conducted under difficult but necessary conditions. The ethical concerns that now seem glaring barely registered. When Dr. Saul Krugman and his colleagues published their early findings, the medical community focused on the novelty of the results. Here, finally, was evidence that hepatitis was not one disease, but two distinct entities, with different modes of transmission and different long-term outcomes. This distinction, between what would become known as Hepatitis A and Hepatitis B was a significant leap forward. Researchers hailed it as a milestone in understanding an illness that had confounded doctors for decades. The acclaim was swift. Articles lauded Krugman's ingenuity, noting the precision with which he documented the course of the illness. His work was seen as an example of how clinical observation, combined with carefully controlled infection, could yield insights unavailable through laboratory models alone. The fact that the subjects were disabled children confined to an institution was treated as incidental, if it was mentioned at all. What mattered to the professional audience was the data, not the context. In medical conferences, slides showed graphs charting the rise and fall of liver enzymes, the timelines of jaundice, the persistence of antibodies. The children's names were nowhere to be found, replaced by case numbers and statistical averages. The suffering that produced those numbers was invisible to the audience, reduced to abstract curves on a screen. Applause followed presentations, and Krugman's reputation grew. Outside the medical world, the studies were almost entirely unknown. The public heard little about what was happening inside Willowbrook. For parents, the institution was already shrouded in secrecy, its wards closed to visitors except on carefully arranged occasions. Few journalists took an interest, and those who did often accepted the official narrative. Willowbrook was overcrowded but dedicated, struggling yet essential. The hepatitis studies were not reported as scandals but as science. This silence was reinforced by the cultural attitudes of the time. In mid-century America, institutions for the disabled were considered necessary, even benevolent. Families were encouraged to surrender their children to state care and to trust that the experts knew best. The idea that those same institutions might be sites of neglect and exploitation was almost unthinkable. Parents who doubted were often reassured with authority. The doctors are professionals. They know what they're doing. This is for the greater good. And so, year after year, the research continued, largely unnoticed beyond the walls of Willowbrook and the pages of medical journals. The voices that might have objected, the children, their families, the staff, were silenced by circumstance, ignorance, or fear. Or some parents suspected something was wrong, but felt powerless to challenge the system. Others clung to the hope that participation in research meant their children were receiving better care than they otherwise would have. Within the scientific community, there were occasional murmurs of discomfort. A few doctors raised questions about the ethics of deliberate infection, especially of children who could not consent. But these voices were drowned out by the louder chorus of approval. Progress, after all, was visible. The data was compelling. And in a medical culture still deeply shaped by utilitarian logic, the promise of a vaccine outweighed the unease of exploitation. The broader society was also distracted. The 1950s and 1960s were decades of upheaval. Civil rights struggles, the Cold War, Vietnam, assassinations. Against this backdrop, the plight of disabled children in a remote institution barely registered. Willowbrook remained hidden in plain sight, its name known mainly to Staten Island locals and to families with children behind its walls. To most Americans, it did not exist. The result was a kind of double reality. In one, the medical journals celebrated advances in knowledge, charting the progress toward eventual vaccines. In the other, children lay fevered and frightened, their bodies turned into repositories of data. The two realities coexisted without ever colliding, separated by walls of language, privilege, and indifference. It would take the intrusion of a camera, years later, to collapse this divide. But in the early years, the hepatitis studies at Willowbrook were treated not as scandal, but as science. They were milestones in journals, not tragedies in newspapers. They advanced careers and theories, not public outrage. And in that silence, the children remained invisible, their suffering converted into professional applause. The early reception of Willowbrook's research tells us something vital about how abuses persist. They do not always thrive in secrecy alone. Sometimes they survive in plain view, legitimized by the approval of respected institutions. As long as the language remains clinical, as long as the victims are distant, as long as the benefits are clear and the costs hidden, exploitation can wear the mask of progress. For years, Willowbrook's reputation remained largely untouched. To most of the public, it was a place of care, however imperfect. To the medical community, it was a site of valuable research. But by the early 1970s, cracks were beginning to appear. Whispers of overcrowding, rumors of neglect, and the occasional testimony from a disillusioned staff member hinted at something darker. Still, the truth remained concealed, until a young journalist decided to look for himself. Geraldo Rivera was not yet a household name in 1972. He was an ambitious reporter working for WABC-TV in New York, known for his persistence and willingness to chase stories others ignored. When a physician and advocate for the disabled invited him to see Willowbrook for himself, Rivera did not hesitate. He sensed there was a story hidden behind the institution's red brick walls, one that no official press release would ever reveal. On a cold day in early 1972, Rivera and a small crew slipped through a side entrance of Willowbrook with a borrowed key. Their camera, small and handheld, captured images that no one outside had ever seen. What the lens recorded was devastating. The first shots showed crowded dormitories where children sat or lay on the floor, many naked, their bodies thin, their faces vacant. Some rocked back and forth, lost in repetitive motions that betrayed years of neglect. Others stared blankly at the camera, eyes hollow with confusion. The rooms were filthy. Stained walls, foul-smelling floors, bathrooms overflowing. The noise was constant. Coughing, crying, incoherent shouts. Staff moved briskly, unable to keep up with the needs of dozens of children at once. Rivera's camera did not look away. It lingered on the sores, the filth, the overcrowding. It captured the silence of children too weak to cry, and the restless energy of others pacing in endless circles. The images were shocking not because they depicted violence, but because they revealed the absence of care, the void of humanity. When Rivera's report, titled Willowbrook, The Last Disgrace, aired on television, it stunned viewers. Millions of Americans, watching from their living rooms, saw for the first time the reality behind the institution's closed doors. The contrast with the official image was unbearable. What had been described as a school looked more like a warehouse of suffering. The promise of state care collapsed into a spectacle of abandonment. Rivera's narration was blunt, almost angry. He spoke of children left in their own waste, of staff stretched too thin to provide even the most basic attention, of conditions unworthy of any human being. He called Willowbrook a disgrace, a stain on New York, a violation of every principle of decency. His words echoed what the camera already made undeniable. The public reaction was immediate. Letters poured into television stations. Families who had once trusted the state with their children demanded answers. Politicians scrambled to respond. For the first time, Willowbrook was not hidden but exposed, its reality broadcast into the homes of ordinary Americans. What Rivera achieved was more than journalism. It was revelation. He broke through the layers of medical jargon, political speeches, and institutional secrecy to show the raw truth. In doing so, he transformed Willowbrook from a little-known institution into a national scandal. But Rivera's report also revealed something else. The hepatitis experiments were not the only injustice at Willowbrook. The entire institution was built on neglect, a place where children were treated as less than human, warehoused rather than nurtured. The experiments had thrived precisely because the environment was already one of degradation. To infect children deliberately in such a place was simply another step in a long chain of abuses. For Rivera, the experience left a lasting mark. He would later describe Willowbrook as one of the most disturbing stories of his career, a moment when journalism's power to expose met the darkest corners of public policy. The footage he captured became iconic, replayed in documentaries, lectures, and courtrooms for decades to come. It was the moment the silence ended. The camera's intrusion changed the trajectory of Willowbrook forever. No longer could officials claim ignorance. No longer could the public remain complacent. The images demanded action. Investigations followed, lawsuits were filed, and the slow dismantling of the institution began. But before those changes could take root, the scandal had to grow louder. Rivera had struck the first blow. The outcry that followed would hammer it home. The night Geraldo Rivera's exposé aired, silence fell across living rooms in New York and beyond. Families sat stunned, watching images that defied belief. Children, naked and neglected, swarmed in overcrowded rooms. Floors stained with filth. Nurses overwhelmed, incapable of caring for dozens at once. Viewers did not see medicine or education. They saw abandonment. The response was explosive. The next morning, newspapers carried headlines echoing Rivera's condemnation. "A disgrace," they repeated, quoting his words. Letters and phone calls flooded television stations, city offices, and the governor's desk. Parents who had long trusted that Willowbrook was at least a safe refuge now felt betrayed. Some had been reassured their children were cared for. Others had suspected conditions were bad, but never imagined such horrors. Now, the truth was undeniable. Politicians, caught off guard, rushed to respond. The governor of New York called for immediate investigations. State legislators demanded hearings. Local officials, some of whom had quietly tolerated Willowbrook's failings for years, suddenly declared their outrage. The same system that had ignored countless warnings now scrambled to appear shocked and decisive. For families, the scandal was deeply personal. Some demanded their children be released immediately, no matter how unprepared they were to care for them at home. Others organized, forming advocacy groups that would later become part of the larger disability rights movement. They demanded accountability, not just for the neglect, but for the very system that had allowed Willowbrook to exist in such a state. Journalists seized on the story. Newspapers sent reporters to Staten Island. Cameras returned to the gates of Willowbrook, filming parents weeping, protesters shouting, politicians touring the grounds for carefully staged press conferences. The once-forgotten institution became a symbol of everything wrong with the state's treatment of its most vulnerable citizens. The outrage extended beyond the neglect. As details of the hepatitis experiment surfaced, anger deepened. The public could tolerate overcrowding explained by budget shortages, perhaps, but deliberate infection of children was something else entirely. Even those who applauded scientific progress recoiled at the thought of children being fed contaminated food in the name of research. What Rivera's camera had begun, the revelations about the experiments intensified. Willowbrook was not just a failed institution. It was a scandal. Lawmakers convened hearings. Families testified, their voices trembling with fury and grief. Former staff spoke of impossible working conditions, of supervisors who discouraged complaints, of a culture where silence was rewarded and questioning punished. Doctors defended their research, repeating the old arguments, that hepatitis was inevitable, that their studies were necessary, that no real harm had been done beyond what would have occurred naturally. But in the climate of public outrage, these justifications sounded hollow. Civil rights lawyers entered the fray. They argued that the residents of Willowbrook had been denied their basic human rights, rights to dignity, to safety, to freedom from exploitation. They framed the case not as an isolated failure, but as a systemic violation, a stain on the very idea of state care. Lawsuits soon followed, targeting not only the institution, but the broader system of institutionalization across New York. Meanwhile, the federal government took notice. Officials from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare reviewed the situation, aware that the scandal threatened not only New York, but the credibility of institutions nationwide. If Willowbrook could exist in such conditions, how many others were hiding behind their own brick walls? The storm of outrage also drew the attention of disability rights activists, who had long fought against institutionalization. They pointed to Willowbrook as proof that large-scale facilities could never truly provide humane care. Their slogan, "Close the institutions," gained new power in the wake of the scandal. For them, Willowbrook was not merely a tragedy, but a rallying cry. As the months unfolded, the pressure mounted. Lawsuits progressed. Advocacy groups grew louder. Journalists kept returning, ensuring the story did not fade. The name Willowbrook became shorthand for disgrace, a symbol of systemic failure. But change did not come overnight. The institution remained open, its residents still trapped within, even as investigations began. For many children, the outrage outside brought little immediate relief. They continued to live in the same crowded wards, under the same broken system. Progress would take years, lawsuits would drag on, and the slow machinery of reform would grind forward. Still, the scandal marked a turning point. Never again could Willowbrook operate in the shadows. Its secrecy had been shattered, its reputation destroyed. The storm of outrage had done what decades of quiet suffering could not. It forced the nation to look at what it preferred not to see. And once seen, it could not be unseen. In the wake of Geraldo Rivera's broadcast, the machinery of accountability lurched into motion. What had long been ignored could no longer be denied. Willowbrook, once an obscure institution hidden on Staten Island, became the focus of lawmakers, journalists, and civil rights lawyers. Investigations multiplied, each layer peeling back new evidence of neglect, abuse, and systemic failure. The first inquiries came from New York State itself. Legislators toured the facility, cameras trailing behind, capturing the same overcrowded wards and unsanitary conditions that Rivera had exposed. Officials expressed outrage in front of microphones, vowing reforms. Yet for families and advocates, these gestures rang hollow. Many of the same politicians had received complaints for years. Now, under the glare of national attention, they scrambled to present themselves as agents of change. Public hearings soon followed. Parents took the stand, their voices cracking as they described visits to Willowbrook, children unwashed, dressed in rags, left listless in their beds. Some testified that they had been misled by administrators, reassured that conditions were far better than they truly were. Others admitted with anguish that they had rarely visited, persuaded that the institution was the only option, and ashamed of the stigma that clung to disability. Their guilt mingled with fury, guilt for leaving their children, fury for being deceived. Former staff members also came forward. Nurses described impossible caseloads, sometimes 100 children to one caretaker. They spoke of being told to keep quiet about shortages, of supervisors who punished dissent. One aide recalled entire nights with no supplies, no clean sheets, no soap, not even gloves, forced to improvise care with whatever could be found. Another remembered watching children wander unsupervised into bathrooms, spreading filth from one bed to another, while administrators dismissed her warnings as exaggerations. The testimony of doctors was more complicated. Some defended the institution, repeating familiar lines about overcrowding and limited budgets. Others admitted what could no longer be hidden. Willowbrook was unfit, unsafe, and inhumane. The hepatitis experiments in particular drew scrutiny. When questioned, researchers framed their work as scientific necessity, repeating the argument that children would have been infected regardless. To many lawmakers and observers, the defense sounded disturbingly cold. The investigations revealed more than neglect. They exposed a system designed to silence accountability. Complaints from parents had been filed for years but rarely acted upon. State inspections were superficial, often announced in advance, allowing administrators to stage temporary improvements. Reports were buried, warnings ignored. Willowbrook had survived not because no one knew, but because too many were willing to look away. The outrage of the hearings reverberated beyond New York. Federal officials from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare launched their own inquiries. National newspapers ran exposés. Editorials condemned not only Willowbrook, but the entire practice of institutionalizing thousands of disabled children in massive, impersonal facilities. The scandal became a symbol of the dangers of warehousing human beings under the guise of care. Civil rights lawyers, seizing the moment, filed lawsuits on behalf of Willowbrook residents. They argued that the institution violated the constitutional rights of its inhabitants, subjecting them to cruel and unusual punishment and denying them equal protection under the law. The legal strategy was groundbreaking. For the first time, the rights of the disabled were framed not as charity, but as civil rights. The courtroom became another arena where Willowbrook's secrets were dragged into the light. As evidence mounted, the picture grew darker still. Photographs taken by investigators showed children with untreated sores, rooms with broken furniture, toilets overflowing. Medical records revealed repeated infections, malnutrition, and unexplained injuries. Testimonies described punishment disguised as discipline, neglect excused as inevitability. The very word school now sounded grotesque, a mask hiding what was closer to a prison. The public followed the proceedings with morbid fascination. Each new revelation deepened the sense of betrayal. For decades, society had comforted itself with the belief that institutions like Willowbrook were necessary, even benevolent. The investigation shattered that illusion. What had been justified as protection was revealed as abandonment. What had been called research was revealed as exploitation. By the mid-1970s, the legal battles reached their climax. The lawsuits culminated in a landmark consent decree in 1975, in which the state of New York agreed to improve conditions drastically and to move toward deinstitutionalization. It was a victory, but a slow and incomplete one. Reform would take years, and many children would continue to suffer before change took root. Still, the decree marked a turning point. For the first time, the state acknowledged responsibility not only for neglect, but for the rights of those it had confined. The investigations into Willowbrook did more than condemn a single institution. They exposed the fragility of the systems meant to protect the vulnerable. They revealed how easily medical ambition, bureaucratic inertia, and public indifference could combine to create conditions of horror. And they forced a reckoning, not only with Willowbrook, but with the entire philosophy of institutional care. The hearings ended, the lawsuits moved forward, and the cameras turned their attention elsewhere. But for the children still inside, daily life changed only slowly. Reform on paper was not reform in practice. The same walls stood, the same overcrowding persisted, the same routines continued. The investigations had opened the door to change, but walking through it would require years of struggle. The hearings had stirred public outrage, but the courtroom would decide whether outrage could be transformed into lasting change. For decades, institutions like Willowbrook had operated beyond real accountability, shielded by bureaucracy and silence. Now, with television footage burned into the nation's memory, lawyers pressed forward with lawsuits that would test not only the state of New York, but the very notion of rights for people with disabilities. The most significant case emerged in 1972, filed by a coalition of civil rights attorneys and advocacy groups on behalf of Willowbrook residents. Their claim was bold and unprecedented, that the conditions inside the institution violated the constitutional rights of its inhabitants. They argued that the residents, though disabled, were citizens entitled to the same protections as anyone else, protections against cruel and unusual punishment, against neglect, against the stripping away of dignity. The legal team framed Willowbrook not as a medical failure, but as a civil rights issue. In their view, the children and adults confined there were not patients in the traditional sense. They were wards of the state, stripped of liberty without due process, subjected to conditions so degrading that they amounted to punishment. The case was groundbreaking in its language, shifting the debate from charity to rights. The state's defense was predictable. Attorneys argued that overcrowding, understaffing, and disease were the unfortunate result of budget constraints, not deliberate cruelty. They insisted that administrators were doing their best under impossible circumstances. As for the hepatitis experiments, defenders echoed Dr. Saul Krugman's reasoning, that infection was inevitable, and the studies had provided valuable knowledge. To the state, Willowbrook was not a violation but a tragedy of circumstance. But the evidence was overwhelming. Photographs of filth and neglect, testimonies from parents and staff, medical records of untreated illness, all painted a picture too stark to ignore. The courtroom became a gallery of shame, each exhibit a reminder of what had been hidden for so long. Judges who visited Willowbrook in person were stunned. One described the institution as inhumane, intolerable, and unacceptable in a civilized society. The case dragged on for years, winding through procedural battles and political resistance. But in 1975, a landmark settlement was reached, the Willowbrook Consent Decree. In it, the state of New York agreed to improve conditions immediately, to reduce overcrowding, to provide better medical care, and to move toward the gradual deinstitutionalization of residents. For the first time, the rights of disabled individuals were enshrined in a legal agreement binding the state to action. The decree was more than a victory for Willowbrook's residents. It became a precedent for disability rights across the United States. Advocates seized upon its language, arguing that if the Constitution protected the residents of Willowbrook, it protected all disabled citizens. The case became a cornerstone in the growing disability rights movement, fueling demands for equal access, community-based care, and the eventual passage of laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. Still, the decree's impact was uneven. Implementation was slow, often resisted by entrenched bureaucracies. Conditions improved on paper more quickly than in reality. For many children, daily life remained grim long after the cameras had left and the court had spoken. Families continued to fight for accountability, often frustrated by delays and half measures. Yet the decree stood as a symbol, proof that the powerless could claim rights, and that institutions could no longer operate in the shadows without consequence. The legal battles also forced a reckoning within medicine itself. The hepatitis experiments, once praised, were now scrutinized under the lens of ethics. Medical schools began teaching Willowbrook as a cautionary tale, an example of how ambition can blind doctors to humanity. Bioethics, a relatively new field, gained momentum in the 1970s, spurred by scandals like Willowbrook and the Tuskegee syphilis study. New rules emerged, requiring informed consent, independent oversight, and protections for vulnerable populations. In this way, the courtroom battles of Willowbrook reshaped not only the institution, but the very practice of research. The residents themselves, though rarely heard directly, became symbols of a broader movement. Their images appeared in newspapers and on protest signs, their suffering invoked in speeches before Congress. For once, the children of Willowbrook were not invisible. They were citizens, plaintiffs, representatives of a cause larger than themselves. The courtroom battles did not erase their pain, nor did they dismantle Willowbrook overnight. But they cracked open the system, forcing recognition of rights long denied. And in that recognition lay the seeds of transformation, not only for Willowbrook, but for institutions across the nation. The Willowbrook Consent Decree of 1975 was hailed as a triumph. Newspapers declared it a victory for justice, a turning point for disability rights. Advocates celebrated the recognition that residents of institutions had constitutional protections. On paper, the decree promised sweeping reforms, reduced overcrowding, improved medical care, individualized education, and, most importantly, a shift away from mass institutionalization toward community-based living. But the reality inside Willowbrook was far slower to change. The decree did not close the institution overnight. Thousands of children and adults remained within its walls, still subject to the same routines, the same shortages, the same inertia that had plagued the facility for decades. Reform was a process, and processes move at the pace of bureaucracies, not at the pace of suffering. Administrators promised compliance, but progress was uneven. New staff were hired, but turnover remained high. Some wards were renovated, others left in disrepair. The population was supposed to decline gradually, but placement in community homes lagged far behind expectations. For years, overcrowding persisted, only slightly less crushing than before. For every improvement celebrated in reports, there were still children lying on the floor, still cries echoing in the night. Families who had fought for the decree grew frustrated. They had demanded dignity for their children, yet visits revealed only marginal change. Advocacy groups pressed for enforcement, filing motions in court to hold the state accountable. Judges scolded officials for delays, but the wheels of reform ground forward slowly, too slowly for the children still inside. For staff, the reforms brought contradictions. Some genuinely wanted to provide better care, but were overwhelmed by the scale of the task. Others resisted change, clinging to old routines, skeptical of new oversight. Training programs were launched, emphasizing respect and human rights, but institutional culture does not transform overnight. The habits of decades, the indifference, the shortcuts, the acceptance of neglect, lingered in the halls. Meanwhile, the public's attention drifted. The scandal had burned bright in 1972 and into the mid-1970s. But as years passed, Headlines shifted. New crises emerged. Economic recessions, political upheavals, international conflicts. Willowbrook faded from the front page. For advocates, this was a dangerous silence. Without constant scrutiny, progress risked stalling altogether. Yet change, though slow, was real. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the number of residents began to decline as more community-based homes opened. Small group residences replaced massive dormitories. Some children and adults, institutionalized for years, stepped into neighborhoods for the first time. For them, the transition was both liberating and disorienting. They had never known life beyond the institution's walls. Freedom was precious, but it came with challenges. Learning routines of daily living, integrating into communities that were not always welcoming, adjusting to a world they had been denied for decades. The hepatitis studies, too, came under sharper ethical scrutiny. What had once been celebrated in journals was now increasingly cited as an example of what not to do. Medical schools taught Willowbrook as a cautionary tale. Bioethics committees invoked it when drafting guidelines, and the language of informed consent grew teeth. The children who had once been treated as data now shaped the rules meant to protect future generations. But for many residents, reform came too late. Years of neglect left permanent scars. Physical disabilities untreated, psychological trauma unaddressed, social skills undeveloped. Some would never fully recover from the years lost inside Willowbrook. Even as conditions improved, the shadows of the past lingered in their bodies and minds. The slow pace of change was not unique to Willowbrook. Across the country, institutions faced similar reckonings. The movement toward deinstitutionalization, inspired in part by the Willowbrook scandal, revealed both promise and pitfalls. Community care often offered greater dignity, but was chronically underfunded, leaving many former residents in precarious situations. The vision of liberation clashed with the realities of limited resources and persistent prejudice. Still, the decree and its aftermath marked a turning point. Willowbrook could no longer operate as a warehouse hidden from view. Every delay, every failure, every lingering abuse was documented, contested, and challenged in court. The institution, once shrouded in secrecy, became one of the most scrutinized facilities in the nation. By the early 1980s, the momentum for closure grew. Advocates argued that no amount of reform could erase the fundamental flaws of mass institutionalization. Willowbrook's very existence was a contradiction, a place meant to provide care that instead inflicted harm. To truly honor the residents, the institution itself would have to be dismantled. The slow road of reform thus pointed toward an inevitable end. Willowbrook would not be reformed into perfection. It would be reformed toward extinction. The consent decree had begun the process, but it was the persistence of families, advocates, and former residents that kept the pressure alive. They refused to let the memory of the scandal fade, reminding the public and the courts that promises on paper meant nothing without action in practice. And so, step by step, year by year, Willowbrook inched toward closure. It would take more than a decade. But the seeds planted in outrage and watered by legal battles would finally bear fruit. By the early 1980s, Willowbrook stood less as an institution of care and more as a monument to failure. Its name had become synonymous with neglect, a shorthand for everything wrong with the practice of institutionalization. Though the consent decree of 1975 had forced reforms, the pressure did not ease. Advocates, families, and courts pushed harder. The conclusion became unavoidable. Willowbrook could not be salvaged. It would have to be shut down. The process was gradual. There were still thousands of residents inside, each dependent on the institution for food, shelter, and the routines of daily life. Closing the facility overnight was impossible. Instead, administrators began transferring residents in phases, moving them to smaller group homes scattered across New York City and beyond. These homes, often housing no more than a dozen people, were designed to provide a more humane, community-based alternative. For some residents, the transition was exhilarating. After years confined to crowded wards, they suddenly experienced freedoms most people take for granted: eating meals at a family-style table, walking in a neighborhood, sleeping in a room with only 1 or 2 roommates instead of 50. Staff in group homes, though not always perfectly trained, were more able to provide personal attention. Parents who had long mourned their children's confinement rejoiced at seeing them live in more ordinary settings. But the move was not easy for everyone. Some residents, institutionalized since childhood, found the outside world overwhelming. They had never learned basic skills like crossing a street, preparing food, or even using money. Their social worlds had been so restricted that life beyond Willowbrook felt alien. Adjusting required time, patience, and resources that were not always available. For many, the scars of neglect, physical, emotional, psychological, remained even after they left the institution's walls. The closing also revealed the unevenness of reform. Some group homes were well-funded and staffed with compassionate caregivers. Others were poorly resourced, plagued by the same neglect that had haunted Willowbrook. Advocates warned that without proper oversight, deinstitutionalization risked simply relocating the problem. Still, even with flaws, the shift to community-based care represented a step forward, a recognition that the massive warehouse model had failed. Politically, the closing of Willowbrook became a symbol of progress. Officials pointed to it as evidence that the state had learned from its mistakes. Governors and mayors spoke of a new era of disability rights, aligning themselves with advocates who had long demanded change. The closure became part of the broader national trend away from institutionalization, accelerated by budget pressures and a growing disability rights movement. By 1987, Willowbrook officially closed its doors. The sprawling campus, once home to over 6,000 residents, fell silent. Some buildings were repurposed for other state uses, others left abandoned, their empty halls echoing with the memory of decades of suffering. For former residents and their families, the closure brought mixed emotions: relief that the nightmare was over, sorrow for the years lost, anger at a system that had allowed it to persist so long. The legacy of Willowbrook's closure rippled outward. It fueled advocacy for the Americans with Disabilities Act, which would be signed into law in 1990, enshrining protections against discrimination. It strengthened the argument that people with disabilities deserved to live in communities, not in warehouses. It pushed bioethics into the mainstream, ensuring that future medical research would be governed by rules of consent and oversight. Yet the closing did not erase the past. For thousands of former residents, Willowbrook remained a defining wound. Some never adjusted to community life. Others carried the trauma of neglect into adulthood, their development permanently stunted. Families, too, bore the scars: guilt for placing their children there, anger at the betrayal of trust, grief for the lost years. The institution was gone, but its shadow lingered. Looking back, the closing of Willowbrook was not just the end of a building, but the end of an era. It marked the collapse of the belief that massive institutions could provide humane care. It forced society to confront the consequences of hiding away its most vulnerable citizens. And it left behind a cautionary tale, a reminder that progress is not only about building new systems, but about dismantling the ones that harm. In the end, the silence that fell over Willowbrook after 1987 was both a relief and a warning. Relief that no more children would suffer within its walls. Warning that the temptation to hide the inconvenient, to prioritize efficiency over humanity, could always return in new forms. The campus stood as a physical memory, bricks and mortar infused with the weight of history. When the gates of Willowbrook finally closed in 1987, the chapter of mass institutionalization in New York entered its twilight. But the impact of Willowbrook did not end with its silence. The scandal had already become a catalyst, reshaping medicine, law, and the broader struggle for civil rights. Its shadow stretched far beyond Staten Island, casting lessons that still resonate decades later. The first and most immediate effect was on the disability rights movement. Advocates who had once struggled to be heard found new momentum in the outrage surrounding Willowbrook. The images of neglected children gave undeniable weight to their arguments. Institutions were not places of care, but warehouses of suffering. Their slogan, "Close the institutions," gained legitimacy, not as radical idealism, but as common sense. Families who had once accepted institutionalization as inevitable now demanded alternatives. Community living, supported housing, and individualized services became the new model. Politically, Willowbrook's legacy influenced some of the most important legislation in American history. The consent decree had established the principle that people with disabilities possessed enforceable rights. That idea rippled outward, shaping court cases and advocacy campaigns across the nation. By the time the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law in 1990, Willowbrook was frequently cited as proof of why legal protections were necessary. The ADA enshrined into federal law what Willowbrook had first exposed: that neglect and discrimination were not simply unfortunate, but unlawful. In medicine, the lessons of Willowbrook became part of the foundation of bioethics. Alongside scandals like the Tuskegee syphilis study, Willowbrook was invoked in classrooms and conferences as a warning. The deliberate infection of children without meaningful consent became a case study in how scientific ambition can override morality. From the late 1970s onward, new regulations required independent review boards for human research, mandated informed consent, and placed strict limits on the use of vulnerable populations. Today, no medical student can graduate without learning the name Willowbrook, not as a model of discovery, but as a lesson in ethical failure. The scandal also reshaped journalism. Geraldo Rivera's exposé became a benchmark for investigative reporting, proving that a camera could pierce institutional secrecy and force public accountability. His footage continues to appear in documentaries and textbooks, reminding each new generation of reporters of the power and responsibility of shining light into hidden places. Willowbrook taught journalism that the act of looking, of refusing to look away, could change history. But perhaps the deepest legacy lies in memory. For the families, survivors, and advocates, Willowbrook became more than a cautionary tale. It became a symbol. Annual commemorations, memorials, and survivor testimonies ensured that the suffering inside its walls would not be forgotten. The campus itself, parts of which were repurposed for a college, still holds remnants of the institution. Walking through those halls, one can feel the echo of history, the silence heavy with what once was. Survivors who returned described the experience as surreal. A place that shaped them through trauma now stands as a reminder of resilience. The long shadow of Willowbrook also revealed the fragility of reform. While institutions closed, the promise of community living was not always fulfilled. Group homes and community programs often struggled with limited funding, leaving some former residents in precarious situations. Critics argued that society had traded one form of neglect for another. And yet, even with these challenges, the shift away from mass institutionalization represented progress. No longer could the state justify locking thousands of disabled children behind walls and calling it care. For the broader public, Willowbrook became a moral touchstone. The phrase, "another Willowbrook," entered the vocabulary of advocacy, used to warn against repeating history. Whenever new scandals emerged, whether in nursing homes, detention centers, or hospitals, the comparison was immediate. Willowbrook had become the standard of disgrace, a symbol that ensured future abuses could not be dismissed so easily. Looking back, the paradox of Willowbrook's legacy is clear. Out of profound suffering came significant change. Out of neglect came rights. Out of exploitation came safeguards. Yet the cost was unbearable. Thousands of children endured years of pain, trauma, and lost potential, so that the rest of society could finally confront its failures. The progress that followed was built on their suffering, a truth that must never be forgotten. In the end, Willowbrook remains a story not only of failure, but of transformation. It reminds us that the most vulnerable are often the first to be silenced, the first to be sacrificed in the name of progress. It also reminds us that exposure, outrage, and relentless advocacy can turn silence into action. The long shadow it cast continues to shape how we think about care, rights, and the responsibilities of science and society alike. When the last gates of Willowbrook clanged shut in 1987, it might have been tempting to believe the story was over. The institution was gone, its residents dispersed into communities, its scandal absorbed into history books. But Willowbrook did not vanish with its walls. It remained, a shadow on the conscience of America, a reminder that the capacity for neglect and exploitation lives not only in the past, but in the present, waiting for complacency to invite it back. The story of Willowbrook is, at its heart, a story about what happens when society looks away. For decades, the institution thrived not because no one knew, but because those who knew did not act. Parents trusted the state. Politicians accepted excuses. Doctors rationalized harm as science. The public preferred not to ask questions. In the silence of that collective neglect, thousands of children suffered. It is also a story about how easily human beings can be reduced to abstractions. In the hands of researchers, children became subjects, their pain translated into data points and graphs. In the speeches of administrators, they became wards, numbers on a budget line. In the eyes of politicians, they were problems to be managed, not lives to be nurtured. Only when a camera entered those halls were they seen again as children, fragile, frightened, deserving of dignity. Willowbrook teaches that neglect is not always loud. It can be quiet, bureaucratic, and disguised as care. It can wear the mask of science, cloaked in professional language and noble intentions. It can persist because the victims are the least powerful, those least able to resist. And it can be rationalized, defended, even praised, until someone finally strips away the disguise. The legacy of Willowbrook lies not only in the reforms that followed, the consent decree, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the rise of bioethics, but in the moral demand it continues to place upon us. It asks whether we are willing to see the invisible, whether we will speak for those who cannot, whether we will resist the easy comfort of looking away. For survivors, the shadow of Willowbrook is deeply personal. Many carry the scars of neglect, physical ailments left untreated, developmental milestones never reached, trust shattered by betrayal. Some found stability in community homes, others struggled for the rest of their lives. Their memories, when shared, speak of loneliness, confusion, and the longing for dignity that was denied them. Each story is a reminder that behind every headline, every lawsuit, every reform, there were individual lives, children who once laughed, cried, and deserved more than what they were given. For society, Willowbrook remains a cautionary tale. Its name is invoked whenever new scandals surface, in nursing homes where elders are neglected, in detention centers where migrants are mistreated, in hospitals where vulnerable patients are exploited. The comparison is always the same. This could become another Willowbrook. The phrase itself has become shorthand for systemic failure, a way of saying that to ignore suffering is to risk repeating history. And for medicine, Willowbrook is a permanent warning. The hepatitis experiments stand as a stark lesson in how the pursuit of knowledge can drift into exploitation when ethics are sidelined. Today's medical students learn the case not to admire the data, but to confront the danger of ambition unmoored from compassion. In every discussion of informed consent, in every lecture on human subjects research, Willowbrook hovers like a ghost, whispering a single command: never again. The campus itself still exists, transformed into part of a college, its buildings repurposed, its wards emptied. Yet those who walk its grounds often speak of a lingering weight, a sense that the walls remember. Survivors who return feel it most sharply. They see past the fresh paint and new classrooms to the memories embedded in the bricks. Nights of fever, days of silence, years of waiting. For them, Willowbrook is not history. It is lived experience. In the end, the lesson of Willowbrook is not confined to disability or medicine. It speaks to a broader truth about power and vulnerability. Whenever a society devalues certain lives, whether because of disability, poverty, race, or any other mark of difference, it risks creating new Willowbrooks. The forms may change, the buildings may look different, but the pattern remains. The powerful justify, the public ignores, and the vulnerable suffer. That is why the story must be told and retold. Not to dwell in horror, but to remind. To remind that institutions built without accountability become cages. To remind that science without ethics becomes cruelty. To remind that silence, no matter how well-intentioned, is complicity. Willowbrook was called the last disgrace, but its disgrace endures as warning. The voices of the children, once silenced, now speak through history, through legislation, through the conscience of those who refuse to forget. They demand vigilance. They demand that we ask, in every generation, who is invisible now? Who suffers behind closed doors? Who will be our Willowbrook if we choose not to see? The gates of Willowbrook are closed, but the question remains open.